Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today. And today in episode 56, the small and mighty real estate investor. Thanks so much for checking out the show. Sorry it's been a little while. Did you miss me? Hope you did. I missed you. We are coming back at you with episode 56 today on the small and mighty real estate investor. The original title of this show was going to be Rental Property Strategy featuring the Debt Destroyer. And a friend of mine who I've played poker with for a while was going to come on the show, and I pretty much kicked and screamed and begged and pleaded, and he literally was going to record with me today. Today is September 4th, so happy Labor Day, everybody. Hope everyone had a great summer. We couldn't get the audio to work. And then he got stuck in traffic on his way home, and time just kind of got away. So I decided I wanted to go ahead and make this episode and talk about the concept of, which is taken directly from the book, The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor by Chad Carson. And we'll put that in the show notes. But it's a concept that challenged me to reframe my thinking, and we'll get more into that during today's episode. If Debt Destroyer ever gets home and decides that he wants to record and we can get the audio to work, we may do a quick follow-up that kind of delves into his particular style when it comes to real estate investing, specifically rental real estate investing with his own small portfolio of rental properties. But we got to keep things moving here. I got a lot I want to get done today, trying to get some content out for you guys. So I decided I couldn't wait any longer, had to go ahead and hit the record button, so here we are. So before we jump into the show, I want to give a very special shout out to our newest premium subscriber, James C. Thank you very much to James C. for subscribing to the show. If anybody else is interested in becoming a premium subscriber and you want to read more about the benefits of becoming a premium subscriber, please check out the link in the show notes and you'll see more information there. I also want to give a very special shout out to our now 36th country listening to the show, all the folks out in Costa Rica. So thank you very much to Costa Rica for tuning in to the Real Talk Personal Finance show. We certainly appreciate your listenership, and we appreciate all of our listeners being a U.S.-focused show. The majority of our listeners are here in the United States, so thank you very much to each and every one of you for listening to the show. We haven't really asked for this in a while, but if you haven't already done so, please feel free to leave a rating and a review for the show. 5 stars is always appreciated if you feel like we've earned it. And if you feel like you can't leave 5 stars, well, I guess you can leave fewer than 5 if you'd like to, but we would really appreciate you reconsidering that. So anyway, if you feel so inclined and want to take a few minutes at the end of the show, feel free to go ahead and leave us a 5-star rating and review. Also, feel free to share this with your friends, family members, coworkers, whoever might want to tune into some personal finance talk that's educational in nature, but also get a little bit of entertainment along the way, along with some great guests that we've had on the show and we'll continue to have on the show. As a matter of fact, we had some really great feedback on the Rent Reverend. We did an episode called Evictions Happen featuring the Rent Reverend. If you haven't checked that out, please go back and listen to it. It's a good one, and I talked to him afterwards, and he was really excited and actually wants to come back on the show, so I'm sure we will have him back on at some point. Thank you very much for those that have contacted the show with your positive feedback on the Rent Reverend. We really do appreciate it, and he also appreciates knowing that he made a difference there and shed some light and some insight into what it really can be like when you are investing in rental real estate, including the bad stuff. All right. So in today's show, I want to highlight a book that I've recently read titled The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor by Chad Carson. And you can buy this book pretty much anywhere. I think Bigger Pockets Publishing are the ones that put it out. So you can check it out on Bigger Pockets. I believe you can also order it on Amazon. We'll, again, put a link in the show notes if you want to just quickly click on that and purchase the book that way and support the show at the same time for no additional cost to you. That would be much appreciated. So one of the things, and I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, But one of the things that the book goes through and talks about, and really the subtitle pretty much spells out for everybody, is how do you reach financial freedom with fewer rental properties? And you can extrapolate that and look at something such as, it doesn't necessarily have to be rental properties. It could be syndication investments. It could be owning and operating small businesses or franchises, anything. There's this tendency for everybody to grow, and a lot of times that means leverage to the hilt. And when is enough enough? So I've always been, for those that have listened to the show for quite some time, a big believer in responsible leverage, especially when interest rates were quite low just a couple years ago. Long-term fixed interest rate debt. You've heard me say that phrase on the show pretty much ad nauseum at this point. And I still do believe in that to an extent. But the more I talk to different people, and this is why I wanted to bring on the Debt Destroyer. Hopefully we'll have a chance to catch up with him at some point soon. And just conversations with people in general, there's a lot of people that don't necessarily subscribe to that. And I know I've had this conversation with the Rent Reverend. I actually had a conversation with my wife not too long ago about this. This was discussed in the book. I've talked to, again, Debt Destroyer on a smaller scale about it. And there are a lot of people out there that don't necessarily believe you need to leverage to the hilt and grow, and expand. There's something to be said for a level of simplicity. And that can be true in a lot of different things. I don't know that we'll get too much into it on the show. I was thinking about doing another show here in the next, couple of months or so on changing property management companies, because I'm in the process of, as many of you probably heard me allude to on a previous show, switching over to just one property management company. I'm also in the process of switching over to just one insurance agency for the property insurance landlord policies. And there's a lot of psychological benefits that come along with that. I'll go through those details probably on another show. But when it comes to owning investments and owning real estate, do you really want to have 100 units, 200 units, however many, 500 units? Is that really necessary to meet whatever your individual goals might be? And for most people, the answer is probably not. But we live in a society where bigger is better, scale, 10x this and that, right? And everybody is just looking to do that. And I think to a certain extent, you need to scale, you need to grow, and oftentimes that means using leverage or debt to do so if you can do it responsibly and productively, right? So you're taking on debt that essentially makes you money, as opposed to putting a bunch of shit on credit cards and then grabbing your ankles while the credit card company makes all the money. I think that's necessary for all of us to an extent. But then there comes a point where you flip the switch. And that's what this book talks a lot about, right? This is not meant to be, this is not a fucking book study club or whatever, right? This is just, hey, I read this book. I've been thinking about this before this book ever came out. And it's starting to make me challenge my own way of thinking about when is enough and when do you go from accumulation to essentially just hitting the brakes. And so one of the things, and there's different strategies, I won't spoil it for you. If you want to check the book out, feel free to pick up a copy. But there's different strategies to accumulate. But basically, it's kind of a concept by Stephen Covey, right, who I think wrote several books, but one of them was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which I actually had that book many, many years ago, and I was reading it, and I was on a bus, like a Greyhound type of bus, to a casino back in the day to play poker, and I left the book on my seat, and I didn't think anybody would give a shit about it, and it actually got stolen, fun fact, believe it or not. So I never did. I guess I was just too lazy to go ahead and buy another copy of it. But anyway, I did read some of the book, and one of the concepts that Stephen Covey talks about is beginning with the end in mind, right? And that's kind of what this is looking at. What are your goals? If you're trying to get to financial freedom / financial independence, FI, whatever the fuck you want to call it, what is that number for you? And maybe that evolves over time, but maybe there's a certain baseline in terms of what you want that number to be. But does it have to be an ever-changing, ever-moving goalpost, right? If you have a certain number, I want X number of dollars per month in passive income, and then you get there, and then all of a sudden it becomes double that, and then all of a sudden we can do better than that. We're going to 5X it, and on and on and on. At what point does that simply stop, and maybe you just adjust it slightly upwards for things like inflation? And so I was always of the belief that, well, as long as we can get long-term fixed interest rate debt, then that's what we need to do. We need to grow, we need to acquire, we need to expand. And I still do believe that. And I actually had a conversation with one of our other guests recently, O-Dog, who's been on the show. And we're going to bring him back at some point once some of these syndications have exited to talk about sort of a full cycle syndication investment and what that's looked like. But, he even said to me, it seems like you're still in the accumulation mode. And I would say that that's true. And there's different ways to look at this. So starting with the end in mind, where are we trying to go? What are we trying to get to? Is there a number that says, okay, if I have X number of dollars per month in passive income, that meets the goal? And I think for most of us, the answer is yes. It's just a matter of digging deep and thinking and strategizing on, okay, well, what does that look like? And what would that number be for me and or my family? Okay. And then you basically back into it. And that's one of the concepts that is talked about in the book. So you say, okay, my goal is this. How many rental properties, if you're going to go about it in that way, what I need to own in order to meet that goal? You come up with the number. You initially can scale again using debt or leverage if you need to grow to that point. And then you go into aggressive payoff or pay down mode. And that, I think, is where I've had the most challenges, because the way I think about it, I have, and I'm sure many of you do, if you've been investing in real estate or rental properties for some time, even in the past handful of years, you probably have some mortgages where the interest rates are fairly attractive, if not extremely attractive, relative to where they are in today's environment, right? And you might think, well, why in the world, if inflation is where it's at, and those rates are as low as they are, and the tenants are essentially paying off the property along with all the other benefits we've talked about with rental real estate investing, why the hell would I pay that off? And that's been my line of thinking for the longest time, and quite frankly, continues to be my line of thinking. If I had money just fall out of the sky, I would have a very, very hard time taking that and just throwing it against, for example, one of our commercial loans, which is at 3.75% fixed for 30 years. I think that would just be a colossal mistake to do that, at least right now. However, the book has challenged my thinking, because there may come a point where even if that is the case, and even if that is true, and even if those are interest rates that we may never see again, maybe it would make sense to do that, because that's going to take away the debt service. You no longer have a principal and interest payment on those properties. And now your cash flow basically jumps through the roof. And the question is, does that allow you to meet your goal? And can you meet your goal sooner rather than keeping the mortgages in place because of things like inflation, profiting, and all that sort of thing? But at the end of the day, your cash flow number still isn't where you want it to be, and that means that you can't necessarily do everything that you want to do at the time that you want to do it. So I'm kind of thinking and talking out loud here as I'm recording this podcast. I had a little bit of an outline when I was coming up with what I wanted to talk to Debt Destroyer about. But for today, I basically just took the book aside and actually have it sitting here on my dining room table as I'm recording this. And there's a quote in there that I think I'll go ahead and reference right now. And it sort of parallels with what my new thinking is, which I'll describe here in just a moment. But the quote from the book is actually a quote from Warren Buffett, believe it or not. And I'm sure everybody knows who Warren Buffett is. And it said that Warren Buffett once said, not to risk something you have to get something you don't need. Not to risk something that you have to get something that you don't need. In other words, once you've won the game, stop playing. Now, does that mean you should stop investing completely? No. But I think your style of investment will change at that time. And so here's how I think about that for myself, my portfolio, our portfolio, my own situation. And that is, continue to scale and use leverage when appropriate to get to where we need to in terms of, for example, number of units, such that once we're there, if I waved a magic wand and those mortgages were killed and gone, that cash flow that we would expect after the rest of the operating expenses would be enough to meet our goals. That's what I'm looking for. And so when I ask myself the question now, if I could wave a magic wand and make all the mortgages disappear and factor in operating expenses, would that passive income number meet our goal? That's basically the underlying and burning question. And the answer right now for us in particular is no. At least it wouldn't in isolation. Now, if you looked at other investments, and this is where it gets complicated because you blend in, as many of you know, I'm also investing in syndications. And actually, we have, for those premium subscribers, I started typing it out before recording this podcast, we will have a piece coming out on Cashflow King's Favorites here shortly with one of the funds that I am personally invested in, and we'll do a separate podcast describing that and why I like it and those sorts of things. But if you're doing, let's say, single-family rentals, and you're also doing syndications, and you're also doing stock market type investments, and also, it gets a little bit more complicated because you have to bring everything together and bring it full circle and blend it. And that's not always an easy thing to do, or not always a simple thing to do, I guess. But if you want to think about it like the book talks about in terms of setting an income floor and view the rest of the investments, for example, the stock market type of investments, as a secondary or tertiary thing, then you could pretty much still do the same math and say, okay, here's the baseline level of income that we would like to have. If we had this many paid off properties factoring in these operating expenses, we would be there. And so let's scale and use debt if necessary, when necessary, to scale up to, for example, the number of units that we would need, and then aggressively go into pay down mode. And so the way that I'm thinking about this, and I would agree with ODOG in our conversation, that we still are in sort of accumulation mode. And so we need to continue to scale and leverage when and where appropriate to build the portfolio to a point where, again, if those mortgages were gone, we would be able to meet our goals. And so I guess right now, the good and the bad is that the good news is I don't have to make that decision right now of whether or not I want to kill mortgages in the threes, right? The bad news is, well, we're not there yet, and I don't have the luxury of being able to make that decision just yet. But that is something that will be coming at some point down the road. And quite frankly, I've not taken the time to do sort of a super deep dive into this because I know we are still in accumulation mode. But what I probably need to do, and when I go back and listen to this episode, it's pretty much a note to self, I think, at this point, is I need to go ahead and start with the end in mind. And I know what the number is. And then we need to back into it and say, okay, well, here's how many units that we would need under certain assumptions. And then that's basically the goal, right? And you pretty much just go from there. So, but again, I'm not there yet. If I killed off all the mortgages today, the cash flow would not be enough to get us to where we want to be. So we're still in growth mode. We still need to scale, and it's not a decision I have to make. I think it's going to be really, really challenging when that time rolls around and we have the number of units that we need to meet the goals that we have to be able to say, okay, that's it. Let's keep it simple. We've done it with the fewest number of properties that we can. And now what we need to do, instead of buying more, is we need to just worry about knocking out mortgages on the ones that we have. And for those of you longtime listeners, this sort of kind of contradicts one of the episodes that I've recorded. And that episode was called The Power of Your Mortgage. I did that quite some time ago. And a lot of that had to do with your personal mortgage on your own primary residence. But you could make the argument that there's certain benefits that would apply with rental real estate, investing in rental property mortgages. But it's sort of a paradigm shift because now it's like, okay, then it goes into this transition where we're just killing off these loans to get the cash flow where it needs to be, you know? And I remember having a conversation with my wife about this, and we talk about this shit all the time, but she said something to the effect of, you know, it's great that we're doing all this and we got, you know, these different investments going on and whatever, but the cash flow becomes way more meaningful and will change only when the mortgages are gone. And she's right. And that's exactly the point that, you know, Chad Carson's trying to make in this Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor book, is that you want to have the fewest number of properties that you need to get to your goals, and then basically just kill off the loans, have a low debt or essentially debt-free portfolio, and go about things that way. Now, from a mathematical standpoint and a return on equity standpoint and things like that, for all the geeks and nerds like me out there, is that the highest and best use of a dollar? Is that the most appropriate thing that somebody can do from a mathematical standpoint? And the answer is no, probably not. Almost certainly not. But from a psychological standpoint and just a lifestyle standpoint, is that the optimal decision for that individual? And I think for a lot of people, the answer is yes. And I've even noticed this in practice. As many of you know, I'm a financial advisor in terms of my day job. I'm a certified financial planner. And I talk to clients about all kinds of different things, most of them retirement related. And a lot of our clients are doing retirement accounts and things in sort of the more traditional way and trying to retire at traditional retirement ages. They're not necessarily part of this whole financial independence movement. Although I did meet with a client recently who will be retiring at the age of 53, which is pretty cool. When I first met her, she had a pile of savings and also a pile of credit card debt. And we went from, that initial meeting to all of a sudden her now, just a handful of years later being on track to retire at age 53, which is pretty cool. But that's besides the point. But where I was going with this is that one of the things that will come up a lot of times with clients is they oftentimes want to have their house and their mortgage paid off going into retirement. And I remember just a short time ago, because I guess some personal bias, quite frankly, bleeding into, work and advising, I would oftentimes walk them through the math of that decision and what that looks like and how that's not necessarily the most mathematically optimal decision. And sometimes, I don't want to say I could change their mind, but sometimes they had never thought of it that way and they were appreciative of it. And other times it was simply, hey, cash flow king, I don't really give a shit. I just don't want to owe anybody anything, and I want to transition into retirement and not have any debt. And I don't care if it's not the most mathematically advantageous move. It helps me sleep at night. And so as time has gone on, I've noticed when that question comes up, which is fairly often, and we have that conversation, I am now starting to bring two different sides to that conversation. So the first one, as I've mentioned, is the mathematical side. And I explain to them how and why it's probably not mathematically optimal. But then I also bring the second part of that conversation piece in, which is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not the right decision for you, because we're all human. We all sometimes act on emotion, right? We're emotional beings, even though we try to take emotion out of investing, right? And sometimes, even though it's not the mathematically most advantageous and correct decision, it's the optimal decision for that person, for that individual, from a psychological standpoint. And a lot of times, the psychology of it trumps the mathematical part of it. And I think that's something that I've noticed more and more in my career as time has gone on, that, personal finance, it is personal, as we've always said, but a lot of it too is emotional and psychological, more so than just mathematically the most correct way to do things. And as long as what we're doing gets us to reach our goals and we have a sense of fulfillment, right? And what we're doing is directionally correct, even if it's not mathematically precise, that's okay. And that's something, just being a little vulnerable here on the podcast, that I've thought a lot about myself in recent times. I think we've spent more money this year on, I don't want to say stuff, but some things, a big, fairly large home improvement and a fairly large recreational purchase, and things that maybe just a couple years ago I would have been like, fuck that, I can take that money, I can invest it, I can make this much on it, and da-da-da-da-da. And that's all great, right? I'm not saying I'm like cashing in everything and just, basically blowing money everywhere, but it certainly feels like that sometimes. But you really need to optimize for happiness and fulfillment, and that's one thing that I am learning, as an individual, as a professional, as just a person, as a human being, that it's okay sometimes to not make the mathematically most optimal decision, as long as I've mentioned, it's directionally correct and it brings you a sense of joy and fulfillment. So if you want to spend some money on something, even though you could take it and invest it and do a time value of money calculation and figure out, how many dollars you'd have at the end of the rainbow if you had just invested that money, as long as the rest of your financial house is in order and you are investing in general and you're saving and you're doing all the things that you probably should be doing, it's okay sometimes to make not the most mathematically optimal choice. So that's one thing I've learned. That's something that just through practice in my career, also as, again, an individual, as a human, as a consumer, that I've experienced in recent times. And reading this book really kind of flipped on its head a lot of the beliefs that I've had previously. Not that I don't still believe those things about the power of your mortgage and return on equity and leverage and all that sort of stuff. I wouldn't be where I am today with these investments without it, quite frankly. But that doesn't mean that that's where you need to be always and forever. And I guess I've gained a new appreciation for those that, whether you realize it or not, have always thought that way or will continue to think that way about what makes the most sense for their life situation, and pretty much ignoring, whether through ignorance or intentionally, that it may not be the most mathematical, precise, and correct decision. So I think that's really important, and that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about today in sort of challenging my own thinking. I think that the path that we're on and the things that we've been doing are still correct for us, both from a mathematical standpoint and from a psychological standpoint. I think I'm going to have more trouble, and maybe I'll do another podcast about this at a later time, when it is time to transition. And we do have what we need in terms of, if we just killed off these mortgages, we would be at our passive income goal, our passive income number. Now we need to transition to, mortgage kill-off mode. And that's not something that I thought that I would really ever think about, but it makes sense. Now, with that said, am I going to go ahead and, pay off my primary residence because I have a syndication investment that comes due and, all of a sudden just go to this debt-free mantra? No, right? That's not what I'm saying. But in the context of this whole rental real estate portfolio thing, I think that it can make some sense. And again, I have sort of a newfound appreciation for those that are doing it in that fashion or have transitioned to doing something in a more conservative way, because again, why risk something that, what was the quote? I'm going to butcher this. Let's go back to the book here. I have the book marked. Let's see. Said not to risk something that you have to get something that you don't need, right? So if you have the number of units and you can get them paid off and meet your goals, then why would you risk that by keeping debt on them just to grow and grow and grow and have additional passive income that far exceeds your goals when you really don't need it? And then you can just focus on simplification, living your life, fulfillment, happiness, enjoyment. That's sort of been my theme, I guess, of 2023, is just doing things that I wouldn't normally do. I picked up a new hobby, which many of you are aware of, and maybe we'll talk about it with Cube Crusher on an upcoming podcast because it's kind of a fun topic. But, it's really about fulfillment, enjoyment. We only go around once. And so I think there's a lot of credence to be lent to this whole philosophy of keeping it simple. So with that said, I think that's going to wrap today's episode on my little monologue, if you will, on what I think about the book and the concept and how I've applied it or plan to apply it in my own life. Hopefully that was helpful for you to listen to as you think about your own situation and your own portfolio and your own investment goals. I think that's pretty good food for thought as far as that goes. So again, thank you very much for tuning in to today's show. This has been episode 56 on the Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor. Again, we'll link to the book in the show notes. For those of you that are premium subscribers, you've probably seen this by now, but just in case you haven't, we do have a premium episode out with Cube Crusher talking about the e-newsletter that we put out a while back. So everybody should have received that via email. You also should have received that premium episode podcast describing the newsletter. If you haven't, please let us know, realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com, and we'll make sure to resend it to you if we need to. Again, thanks for your consideration. Thanks for your support. It really does mean the world to us. Feel free to email the show with any feedback. Feel free to share the show. Leave a rating and review. Become a premium subscriber if you're not already. And that's pretty much all I have for you at the moment. Thanks very much for tuning in. We will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.